Good afternoon. The hearing will come to order, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. Sorry for the delay. Both houses are in very active mode. We just had a series of votes, and I know Chairman Rubio is very much engaged on the healthcare issue, but he will be here very shortly. Chinese officials repeatedly tell me that I should focus more on the positive aspects of China and not dwell so much on the negative. I've heard it from diplomats, I've heard it from people when I've traveled in China, in Beijing, as well as in Shanghai. That is an extremely difficult task when you read the horrifying and sadistic accounts of torture and enforced disappearances experienced by lawyers and rights advocates. It's hard to be positive when you contemplate Liu Xiaobo's cancer diagnosis and the fact that China effectively silenced its most brilliant democracy advocate. Earlier today, I'm happy to say, again, another voice from the administration at a hearing before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in answer to a question that I posed. Nikki Haley clearly and unmistakably said he should be free to go wherever he wants to go, and that would include he and his wife coming to the United States to get the very necessary medical treatment that he has been denied. The empty chair at Oslo, and I was there, speaks volumes about the Communist Party's abiding fear that freedom will upend the power of the privileged few when they should be seeing liberty as a path to a greater peace and prosperity. At a hearing last month in the Subcommittee on Global Human Rights in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I heard testimony from my fellow colleagues from the wives of 5 detained or disappeared human rights lawyers. The courageous women have become effective advocates from their husbands and for their husbands and for all those detained in the 709 crackdown. They described in horrifying detail the physical, mental, and psychological torture experienced by their husbands, including marathon interrogation sessions, sleep deprivation, beatings, crippling leg torture, and prolonged submersion in water. Many of their husbands were also forced to take alarming quantities of drugs, including tranquilizers, barbiturates, antipsychotic drugs, and other unknown substances daily. What they described was shocking, offensive, immoral, inhumane, but frankly not surprising. It is also possible that Chinese officials believe the international community will not hold them accountable. After the hearing, I wrote the heads of the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the World Health Organization, as well as Secretary of State Tillerson and Ambassador Nikki Haley. I asked for a condemnation of the practice of torture and medical experimentation on prisoners of conscience. I've also asked for investigation so that serious questions will be asked of the Chinese government. We know that those questions have been asked in the past by many, including special rapporteurs for torture. I remember when Manfred Nowak made his trip to China, the report was scathing, and yet nothing has been done to ameliorate this horrific abuse. Finally, I have asked for accountability. I have asked Secretary Tillerson to start investigations under the Global Magnitsky Act, a bill that I led on the House side last year, so that any Chinese government officials complicit in torture should be never allowed to benefit from entry to the United States or access to our financial system. The issues of torture and residential surveillance in a designated location, effectively enforced disappearances, will be priorities of mine and so many others, and the chairman, our good friend Marco Rubio, as this commission moves forward. I believe these issues are where diverse and multi-level coalitions can be built to raise issues with the Chinese government. I would also think we need to do more to prioritize the protection of human rights lawyers and their families. At the hearing last month, I heard the phrase, the war on law, used to describe the systematic effort to eviscerate the network of human rights lawyers. That phrase struck me because though the number of human rights lawyers in China is small, what they stand for was nothing less than the rule of law for everyone, particularly those persecuted or aggrieved by the Communist Party. They stand for the right of everyone in China, religious believers, ethnic minorities, petitioners, women who have been forced to undergo forced abortions, labor activists, or victims of corrupt or of the barbaric population control policies, to always have a fair hearing, due process, and a justice that is not politicized. We all remember the case of Chen Quanzhen, who fought so hard for the women in Lingyi who were being forced into abortions and forced sterilizations, and for that he was brutalized, as well as his wife. And of course, the Communist Party sees the idea of fair hearings, due process, and justice is not politicized as a dangerous idea. It means that they should be accountable to the people. Imagine that. To hundreds of millions of people, in fact, seeking redress for persecution and party corruption. Xi Jinping is feted in Davos for his commitments to openness and the rule of law, but it is rule of law for the few and the privileged, and rule by law for the rest. The failure to implement the rule of law to favor a type of lawlessness in the pursuit of keeping the Communist Party in power has serious and lasting implications for U.S.-China relations as well. We must recognize, after the failure of 2.5 decades of the so-called engagement policies, that China's domestic repression drives its external aggression. Its mercantilist trade policies and its unimaginable decisions to keep propping up a murderous North Korean regime. I know the Chinese government wants me and others to focus on positive things. I think one positive development here is that the spouses and families of rights advocates and lawyers have given Beijing a rightly deserved headache. They have refused, absolutely refused, to be silent about their spouses' detentions or disappearances, and have used the internet and media to get out their message. This trend is something new, something different, something we need to honor and deeply respect, because they are under great pressure to be silent through intimidation, harassment, threats, and detention. I want to say to our witnesses, Chung Yu, that we appreciate your testimony here today and the fact that you are speaking out on behalf of your father. We know that this commission is an advocate for you, your family, and your entire family. If you or your family face reprisals because of your testimony here today, the Congress will take it as a personal affront to the work of this body. I know your petition has gathered 94,000 signatures. Please make sure that my name is 94,001. The one thing that gives me hope is that the people of China long for liberty, justice, and opportunity. We saw it in the hearts and minds of those who braved the tanks, including Tank Man, during the Tiananmen Square possibilities that turned into a terrible, terrible tragedy and slaughter. But it was the heart of the Chinese people that came through. They want freedom. They want democracy. They want respect for fundamental human rights. The need for principled and consistent American leadership is now more important than ever, as China's growing economic power and persistent diplomatic efforts have succeeded in dampening global criticism of its escalating repression and failures to adhere to universal standards. The U.S. must be a beacon of liberty and a champion of individual rights and freedoms. The United States must also continue to be a voice for those silenced, jailed, or repressed in China. We cannot and will not forget those in China who bravely are seeking liberty and justice and the inalienable rights that we all share here in the United States. Like China's human rights lawyers, like Liu Xiaobo, those who bravely seek peaceful change in China. That's our focus, that's our priority, and that's our hopes and prayers are for them. I'd like to now turn it over to Distinguished Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for filling in. As you know, the Senate's involved in a number, one big issue on the health care issue, and it delayed us here a little bit while we were involved in a conversation. So I thank you for starting it and for taking over, and all of you for being here this afternoon. This hearing is entitled Gagging the Lawyers, China's Crackdown on Human Rights Lawyers and Its Implications for U.S.-China Relations. We'll only have one panel testify today. It's going to feature Terrence Halliday, who's the co-director of the Center on Law and Globalization at the American Bar Foundation, and also the co-author of Sita Liu, co-author with Sita Liu of the book Criminal Defense in China, The Politics of Lawyers at Work. Tung Biyao, a Chinese human rights lawyer. He's a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies and co-founder of the Open Constitution Initiative and China Human Rights Accountability Center. Sha Cheng-yu, who's son of imprisoned human rights lawyer Sha Lin and a student at Liberty University. and Li Xiaorong, who is an independent scholar, formerly with the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at the University of Maryland. We thank you all for being here. Before we move to the topic at hand, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the news this week regarding the reported transfer of 2010 Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo from prison to a hospital for treatment for late-stage liver cancer. This should not be confused with an act of mercy on the part of the Chinese government. His 8 years of imprisonment due to his eloquent appeals for nonviolent political reform and protection of human rights remains a travesty of justice and a stain on China's human rights record. Dr. Liu's medical parole is not the equivalent of an early release from his prison sentence, or that he has the freedom to meet with his wife, Liu Xia, and other family members and friends. I've urged the President to seek the humanitarian transfer of Dr. Liu and his wife to the U.S. to explore what medical options may be available. I'd also like to briefly read a quote from an editorial that ran in the Communist Party-controlled Global Times. The writer gloated, quote, "China has not collapsed as the West forecast in the 1980s and 90s, but has created a global economic miracle. A group of pro-democracy activists and dissidents lost a bet and ruined their lives. Although Liu was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, he is likely to face tragedy in the end." End quote. What a grotesque expression in this Communist Party-controlled publication. Any notion that Dr. Liu will receive adequate medical care under the supervision of his captors is simply absurd. I was pleased to read this morning that the newly arrived U.S. Ambassador, Terry Branstad, has urged the Chinese government to allow Dr. Liu to seek treatment overseas. As the Nobel Committee noted, Dr. Liu exemplifies the long and nonviolent struggle for human rights in China. That same spirit animates the work of the Chinese rights lawyers we will hear about today. July 9th, 2017 marks the 2-year anniversary of the start of what has been described as an unprecedented nationwide crackdown on human rights lawyers and legal advocates in China, an event that's come to be known as the 709 Crackdown. While perhaps unprecedented in scale and coordination, nearly 300 rights advocates were detained, summoned for questioning, or disappeared. The crackdown began much earlier. Xi Jinping's rule has been marked by extensive campaigns to silence political dissent, curtail civil society, and ensure ideological loyalty to and conformity with the Chinese Communist Party. No sector of society is untouched. Business leaders, bloggers, social media users, university professors, journalists, religious adherents have all been targeted. But China's rights defenders and lawyers have been the tip of the spear for even longer. As our second witness, Dr. Tung Biyao, can no doubt attest. This small but tenacious group is closely linked to the growth in legal rights consciousness among ordinary Chinese citizens. China's rights defense movement converged around the incidents of injustice that resulted from the single-minded drive of the Chinese government and the Communist Party for rapid economic growth without political reform. The victims of injustice included farmers who lost land from government expropriation, urban residents forcibly evicted without fair compensation, migrant workers trying to recoup unpaid wages, teachers, laid-off workers, and Army veterans who lost their pensions, and parents whose children were made ill from ingesting contaminated milk powder. The movement has expanded to support free speech, the pro-democracy aspirations of Hong Kongers, ethnic minority rights, and other issues. Our first witness, Dr. Halliday, has conducted literally hundreds of interviews with these men and women, a group bound together by their shared conviction regarding the importance of protecting basic legal freedoms in a system where rule of law remains aspirational at best. Among the lawyers featured in his latest book are those whose names and stories have captured headlines for the last 2 years. Their unjust and unexpected detentions nearly 2 years ago was, for many, the start of a long and harrowing ordeal marked by months in isolation, torture, coerced confessions, and other forms of mistreatment. Some of these lawyers, like Zhang Tianyong, whose wife I had the privilege of meeting earlier this year, remain in detention. Others, like Li Huping, are no longer in captivity, but the brutality they experienced left them visibly physically altered. Many have been disbarred and will never practice law in China again, and still others live under constant surveillance and harassment. It is tempting, in the face of China's worsening and increasingly brazen human rights violations, to grow disheartened, which is why I think it is equally important to spend some time today examining another part of this crackdown that is unprecedented, and that is the response of some of the family members of those detained. By their own telling, many of the wives of these rights lawyers had not previously been involved in their husbands' efforts to pursue justice and accountability from their government. But as the present system conspired against them and their families, they became advocates in their own right. In case after case, these women took up the mantle of advocacy on behalf of their husbands. Their personal accounts of intimidation and harassment, of landlords refusing them housing, of children denied entry into local schools, of movement restricted and lives lived under constant surveillance, coupled with their compelling public defense of their husband's innocence, has, in the words of Dr. Halliday, opened up a, quote, new line of struggle that we have not seen before in China, end quote. Similar courage and boldness is on display today with the testimony of Sha Changyu about his father's plight. Even for those of us who hold steadfastly to the view that the United States foreign policy must be infused with the principled defense of human rights and the promotion of basic freedoms, there remains the notion that change in China will ultimately come from within. And I agree. And China's rights defense lawyers are at the vanguard in pressing for systematic change, in seeking accountability and redress, and in working towards a day when China is a nation where the law is used to protect rights, not to suppress them. It is our duty to stand with them in this monumental task, and it is our honor to welcome all of you here today. And I will begin with the testimony of Mr. Halliday. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, and distinguished members of the Commission, I'm privileged to be invited here to participate in this hearing. I have a long-standing admiration for the work of the Commission. In my opening remarks, I address the meaning and the significance of China's unprecedented crackdown on lawyers almost 2 years after its onset in early 2015. My comments are derived from the empirical research of my research team into criminal procedure law and criminal defense lawyers over the past 12 years. Our findings, published in our book, Criminal Defense in China, conclude that China's legal system and China's legal profession have come an enormous distance since the enactment of the 1979 criminal procedure law. Nevertheless, on a number of issues integral to the defense of basic legal freedoms, China has turned away from reform, both in its law and in its treatment of a key segment of the legal profession. A sudden turning point occurred on 9th of July 2015 when China launched a nationwide crackdown on activist lawyers. The 709 crackdown, as it has been colloquially labeled, has been unprecedented in scale and severity. Within days, hundreds of lawyers across China were detained, disappeared, and interrogated. Lawyers have been intimidated, tortured, charged with serious crimes, and sanctioned severely. Why did this crackdown occur? Research on activist lawyers reveals deep grievances held by hundreds of millions of Chinese who suffer from health-threatening pollution, from takings of their homes and land, from widening inequality, from religious controls and persecution, from discriminatory treatment of minorities, from inadequate protection of workers and women, and from exploitation and vulnerability of migrant laborers, among others. The sheer quantity of disaffected and angry populations can fuel widespread social unrest. Lawyers often become the help of last resort when every other channel has failed. Therefore, over the past several years, the Chinese Communist Party has faced a double threat to its survival. On the one hand, economic and social problems appear to be multiplying and intensifying. On the other hand, lawyers increasingly have been articulating and expressing those grievances through law in highly visible ways. What triggered the crackdown on lawyers on 9th of July 2015? Over the last several years, activist lawyers significantly increased in numbers. Hundreds of new activists, many of them young and well-educated, signaled their willingness to join the front line. Lawyers magnified their ability to mobilize. Since 2011, lawyers increasingly came together in large defense teams in difficult trials. Through social media, activist lawyers could create instant crowds to rush to a courthouse or defend a lawyer being harassed by police. Nationwide, online networks could mobilize hundreds of lawyers for new cases or emergency situations. The power of social media multiplied the impact of a new type of lawyer. So-called die-hard lawyers actively used the social media and street theater to activate supporters and expose problems in defending their clients. Some lawyers had accumulated thousands or even millions of followers on Weibo, China's equivalent to Twitter. Clearly, China's leaders felt vulnerable to activist, die-hard, and ordinary lawyers' enhanced powers to mobilize publics. What motivates these lawyers to exhibit such courage in the face of a regime that does not hesitate to use inhumane and even life-threatening measures against its opponents? Our research reveals that courage for many lawyers arises from their own life experiences, such as harms to parents during the Cultural Revolution, participation in the 1989 Tiananmen movement, or shocking experiences, unexpected, in their legal practices. Many lawyers build their courageous representation upon legal ideals that underwrite the good political society. First, they insist on the protection of basic legal freedoms, such as the right to be represented by a lawyer, due process in trials, and fair adjudication. They insist upon freedoms of speech, of association, and religion. Second, they are committed to a vibrant civil society as it is expressed through voluntary associations and an open public sphere. Third, these activist lawyers strongly oppose arbitrary executive power, and they call for checks and balances within the state. Our research documents that many lawyers, notable and ordinary practitioners, also draw their courage from their Christian faith. Christians insist upon the values of equality, most importantly, that in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law, said one lawyer, quote, Chairman Mao is as equal as me, close quote. They champion the Judeo-Christian emphasis on a political and legal order that delivers justice, often quoting, like Martin Luther King, the biblical prophets Amos and Micah. They believe in fairness, that justice should be available reliably and fairly to all, whether they are Han Chinese or Tibetan, party members or Falun Gong members. Finally, they hold China's law accountable to God's law. I consider it probable that party leaders fear Christian lawyer leaders who have strong relationships with Protestant churches across China, China's largest civil society group, and some who have significant international connections. What does the lawyer crackdown tell the world and us about China's future? Viewing China through the lens of courageous lawyers reveals that legal change in China has turned toward repression, a repression which has taken deeply sobering turns since 2015. Nevertheless, deep impetuses for change remain within China. Repressive actions themselves may be self-subversive. Notable activists refuse to surrender easily or to go quietly. Their wives, their comrades spring to their defense. Significant numbers of grassroots lawyers continue to harbor visions of alternative legal, political futures. An international community ratchets up its efforts at solidarity, pressure, and support for lawyers. Where goes China may depend very considerably on where go its lawyers. Will it follow long, peaceful paths of reform and the expansion of basic legal freedoms that are offered by these activist lawyers? Or will China lurch towards a violent, explosive path that could lead to fearful, unpredictable outcomes? To honor the Commission's time constraints, I conclude but I look forward to offering some recommendations during the question and answer section. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll recognize our second witness, Tung Biao.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of CECC, I'm honored to be invited to testify at this especially important hearing. The coming July 9th, second anniversary of 709 Crackdown, there will be events in DC, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and some European cities to mark the inaugural China Human Rights Lawyers Day, which I have been organizing for months. Chinese human rights lawyers have since 2003 become one of the most active and effective forces in China defending rights and freedom, and inevitably have been the target of the government's persecution since the beginning of the rights defense movement. Because of my work of promoting human rights and democracy since 2003, I was disbarred, banned from teaching, and eventually fired, banned from traveling, and kidnapped for 3 times by the secret police. In 2011, I was detained in a black jail for 70 days in an extreme form of solitary confinement, physically and mentally tortured. My wife and daughter were banned from traveling abroad, and my wife fired by the company he worked for due to the pressure from Chinese government. Collective punishment is frequently used by Chinese authorities to maximize intimidation. The purpose of torture and collective punishment was to make me stop my human rights work, but I didn't. The persecution of rights lawyers reached its peak in 709 Crackdown. 8 lawyers are still in prison, including Jiang Tianyong and Tu Fu Wugan. Wang Quanzhang is still disappeared since July 2015. His family and lawyers don't even know whether he's alive or dead. Dozens of lawyers were severely tortured, including beatings, electric shocks, sleep deprivation, death threats, months or years of solitary confinement, so on and so on. Notably, it has been confirmed that many lawyers and activists were force-fed with medicines which caused them muscle pain, blurred vision, and other physical and mental harm. The prison conditions and the treatment in detentions are extremely inhuman and cruel in China. As we know, deliberate neglect aggravated Liu Xiaobo's cancer. Both Liu Xiaobo and Liu Xia clearly expressed that they want to go out of China. The rights defense movement has emerged since early 2000 as a new focus of the Chinese democracy movement after the Xidan democracy war movement in late 1970s and the Tiananmen democratic movement in 1989. Let's take a brief look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party. When the Communist Party was facing a deep political and economical crisis in the late 1970s after waves of political campaigns and the brutal Cultural Revolution, it had to introduce a process of legalization and marketization. Legalization was necessary for establishing social order and market economy, and thus was beneficial to the political system when mass mobilization was not applicable anymore. Millions of laws and regulations were made, legal professions were recovered, but the CCP never meant to accept a democratic transition or rule of law. Oppositional politics is prohibited, but we lawyers and rights advocates tried our best to use existing legal channels to defending human rights and freedom. Starting with a narrow space, the rights defense movement attracted more and more supporters, such as lawyers, bloggers, persecuted religious groups, victims of human rights abuse, and political dissidents. There are incredible achievements under such a repressive regime. For the past 14 years, the development of the rights defense movement was expressed through at least 4 trends, namely organization, street activism, politicization, and internationalization. There's a clear limitation to China's legalization. It is one-party rule, the number 1 priority of the CCP. Once the CCP sensed the use of law could be a potential challenge, it never hesitates to nip it in the bud. When Xi Jinping took his office, What the CCP was facing was increasing crises, political, economical, and social and ideological crises. The calculation of Xi Jinping is that without a war on law to destroy the resisting ability of the social and political movement, a color revolution will occur, and thus the monopoly of power of the Communist Party will be in danger. This is the political background of the 709 crackdown. Once again, the CCP's war on law makes it urgent and necessary to change U.S. human rights policy towards China. In 1989, all democracies condemned the Tiananmen massacre, sanctioned Chinese dictators, and supported Tiananmen activists in jail or in exile. Yet very soon, Western leaders couldn't wait to welcome Chinese butchers and dictators, rolling out their red carpet, replete with eager hugs and state banquets. In 1994, U.S. government granted permanent MFN status to China to link human rights to trade, despite protests from human rights groups. Then China was allowed to enter the WTO and international market. China was given the opportunity to host Olympics, World Expo, APEC, and the G20. China was voted in as a member of UN Human Rights Council again and again. Now China has become the second largest economy and is playing an active and aggressive role on the international stage. Cyber attacks, South China Sea aggression, abducting overseas booksellers and activists, Confucian institutes which erode academic freedom, the list goes on. China is demanding a rewrite of international norms, wanting to create a new international order in which rule of law is manipulated, human dignity is debased, democracy is abused, and justice is denied. In this international order, corruption and persecution are ignored, perpetrators are immune, and dictatorial regimes are united and smugly complacent. I'd like to point out that U.S. human rights policy toward China has long been based on a series of erroneous theories and mistaken presumptions regarding Chinese politics and society. I don't have time to go into details, but the erroneous theories cover misunderstanding of China's market, constitution, international accountability, NGO, so on and so on. Finally, I'd like to offer a few recommendations here. Link human rights to trade and other important issues that CCP cares about. Implement the Global Magnitsky Act to ban Chinese perpetrators and corrupt officials from entering the United States. Punish U.S. and Western business which cooperate with Chinese authorities and participate in human rights abuses. And the 110 Confucius Institute in the United States. Don't fund the oppressor. Support the real NGOs, not the gongos. Name and shame. Expel China from the Human Rights Council of UN. A powerful and autocratic China will bring calamities to mankind. Supporting democracy and human rights in China not only corresponds to American declared values, it will also benefit American politics, society, and economics in the long term. Please stand on the side of Chinese people, not on the side of Chinese Communist Party. China should be represented by the human rights lawyers, activists, dissidents, and all Chinese people fighting for freedom and democracy, not the illegitimate party and the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Our third witness is Sha Chong-yu. He's the son of a prominent imprisoned human rights lawyer, Sha Lin. He's currently a college student at Liberty University, but his mother still lives in China. And it is in our view, let me just say this, it's incredibly important that we make clear that his appearance here today should not in any way lead to any pressure on him or harm on him or his family. If such an event exists and happens, we will view it as a direct attack by Chinese government and Communist Party officials as a result of your testimony here today. And it is something I want to make abundantly clear, that it is something we'll be watching and strongly condemning and pointing to, and knowing that it's directly related to your appearance here today. So it's our hope that that's not the case. But we thank you for being here.
Dear Congressman and Congresswoman, respectful audiences, I'm Xia Chongyu, son of Chinese human rights lawyer Xia Lin. It's such a great honor here to share about my father's situation and what my family has been through these past years. My father dedicates himself to be the voice for the voiceless and provides pro bono legal assistance to the victims of human rights violation cases. On November 8, 2014, my father was abducted by secret agents without a warrant. The government did not inform my mother of my father's arrest until 5 days after the fact, and denied my father's basic rights to meet with his defense attorney for 3 full months. Meanwhile, the police kept asking my father about the politically sensitive cases he represented. My father was physically and mentally tortured by the police, who used interrogation techniques such as shining a strong light on his eyes to keep him awake for days. They tried to break him so that he would confess to fraud, but all their attempts failed. After 600 days of imprisonment, he was unfairly tried in a closed-door hearing. My father was denied a personal statement in court, and none of the witnesses had a chance to testify. The Second Court of Beijing sentenced my father to 12 years in prison for fraud without appropriate evidence. My father's final sentence was delivered without a fair second trial in February 2017. No one ever accuses my father in person. I refuse to accept this illegal and unjust verdict. In April, I presented my petition at a convocation of Liberty University, and the responses was overwhelming. However, when I tried to deliver my petition with over 14,000 signatures to the Chinese embassy, no one would even see me. Before I left, I read my petition aloud at the gate of the embassy. At this moment, I have collected over 94,000 signatures. Most of them come from Americans, and the rest are from the other countries around the world. I'm not alone. As a rising nation, China's deteriorating human rights record is unacceptable. When a human rights lawyer cannot secure his own fundamental rights, I believe every member's right in the society are threatened. Human rights lawyers are the cornerstone of the society. I hope the U.S. government can increase its involvement in such cases in the future. Moreover, I wish the Congress of America could urge the Chinese government to stop controlling the judiciary system and stop the persecution against 709 lawyers. Lastly, I plead the White House summon the Chinese ambassador and ask the Chinese government to respond to me and my 94,000 petition supporters. Meanwhile, I recommend the White House or State Department issue a clear policy regarding this type of case. By making a clear stance, the U.S. government would communicate to the world that human rights violations will not be tolerated. I appreciate the Congress for organizing this hearing so that our voice could be heard by the world. Thank you.
And we thank you for your testimony here today. We're going to begin our questions, and I'm going to turn it first over. Oh, I apologize. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, hold on. I apologize. So our final testimony, I said final earlier, and that's what threw me off. There's a seat missing. That's what threw me off, so in between the both of you. So Li Xiaorong is an independent scholar, formerly with the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at the University of Maryland. And thank you for being here. And we're ready for your testimony. The microphone, if you could just push the button. Could tell them to push the button for her, please? Thank you.
And
There we
thank you, all the commissioners, staff at CECC. And I also want to thank all my panel of presenters, Mr. Holliday, Ten Biao, and Xia Chongyu for their excellent testimony and very powerful. My assignment today is to talk about what Congress and U.S. government can do to respond to China's worsening human rights problems. I just want to add to the testimony one very concerning pattern of persecution, which is brought up by what Mr. Smith mentioned, the case of Liu Xiaobo. As we all know, Liu Xiaobo is due to be released in 2 years. He has been serving 9 years out of an 11-year sentence. The problem is for 9 years, the outside world knows almost nothing about what happened to him inside the prison walls. Secrecy created the perfect conditions for abuse, including torture, mistreatment, and medical neglect or medical deprivation. This clearly are abuses that are deliberative. And we have identified the deliberative methods and tactics used in the past years to punish human rights lawyers, activists, political or religious dissidents, especially in ethnic minority regions, Tibet and Xinjiang. As you all may know, activist Xiao Sunli died from delayed medical treatment in detention on March 14, 2014, after she was hospitalized in critical condition while authorities had previously rejected her lawyer's multiple requests for medical bail. 5 days after Xiao Sunli's death, the Tibetan political prisoner Gosho Lapsang died due to torture and lack of medical treatment in prison. One human rights organization has kept a medical watch list tracking cases of currently detained or imprisoned individuals who suffer from deteriorating health and have been deprived of adequate medical treatment and denied release on medical grounds. So what should Congress do? What should the US government do to respond? This is a very big topic. In my limited few minutes, I just want to throw a few suggestions out there for a discussion. One stance that Congress can take is also the most obvious one, but often seemingly the most difficult one, which I have previously discussed in this forum. It is simply to be consistent and steadfast. Let me explain. The CECC and the State Department both produce carefully researched annual human rights reports based on excellent data and expertise analysis. However, these reports bear little relevance to US policy towards China when it comes to human rights. Human rights tend to be overpowered by trade, business, or regional strategic interests. Data and facts in these congressional and government reports about China's worsening human rights problems often do not have a voice in such policies. I know this may sound naive and simplistic, but being consistent and sticking to one set of human rights standards, universal human rights, in congressional resolutions, whether it concerns Cuba or Iran or North Korea or China, is what gives US human rights policies a measure of credibility. My second thought is that Congress should continue to support programs or organizations that assist victims of rights abuses, like the July 7 crackdown lawyers and Liu Xiaobo. For instance, right now, Congress should, I know you already did, press the administration to issue a standing invitation to Liu Xiaobo and his family immediately and make contingency plans to make sure that he will receive the best treatment and care this country can offer if the Chinese government let him go. The EU funds emergency relocation and shelter programs that evacuate and assist human rights defenders at high risk. Congress must guard our political refugee programs against xenophobia. My third thought is that Congress must, like Tenbia mentioned, this Global Magnitsky Accountability Act. Congress must urge the administration to comply with it, to seek accountability for rights abuses. Congress passed this act, and it was signed into law last year. It is a brave new tool that the U.S. government must use to hold perpetrators and corrupt officials in the Chinese government accountable. For years, critics of economic sanctions argued that they will hurt the average Chinese, and many of us have also realized that the U.S.-China human rights dialogues have produced no real impact. Now, this new law can be used to target abusive officials with no quota restrictions on how many from which countries could be designated, as long as credible evidence against them can be presented. But the decision is with the administration, where such decisions might very well be subjected to whims of other priorities. Congress should make sure that the president's other interests in China do not get in the way of holding Chinese officials accountable for human rights abuses. My very last thought is that Congress should support U.S. actions holding the Chinese government accountable for its failures to live up to its international human rights obligations. China is a member of the Human Rights Council. It has signed or ratified 9 out of 10 major human rights treaties, such as the Convention Against Torture, which China ratified 29 years ago. Yet the Chinese government continues to derail rule of law reforms, undercut any independence of the judiciary, and disregard legal safeguards for detainees from torture. As China becomes a rising world power, the government's systematic human rights abuse raise serious questions about its credibility or fitness to take global leadership in areas where the U.S. is retreating. The Chinese government has a clear track record of signing up for international human rights treaties, meanwhile violating them outright back at home and in countries where it is investing, lending money, and building infrastructures. It is important to lay bare this track record of deceit and hypocrisy. A government that can't honor its own commitments, can't keep its own promises, has no credibility. Congress should urge the administration to actively engage other member states at the UN to keep out governments with worsening human rights conditions like China from the Human Rights Council. Dig in, do not retreat from the multilateral background to fight abusive governments and stand up for victims. Thank you.
We thank all of you for being here today. We'll now begin to the questions. It's all 4 of them, right? I'm not, all right. I'm going to let, we're going to hear first on the question round from the co-chairman, and we thank you for opening the hearing today.
Thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chairman, which has been extraordinary for many, many years. Let me just, there was an excellent and incisive op-ed in the Washington Post on June 27th, co-wrote by Yang Jianli, who's here, who has testified before this commission on several occasions, and Jared Genser. And just very briefly reading from it, and you'll see why I'm raising it in a moment. They point out, as China's power and influence have increased, Western democracy have collectively engaged in self-censorship on human rights, choosing to prioritize what they have clearly believed to be their more important interests over their purported values. In the past 5 years, since Xi became president, discussions of human rights have been relegated to fruitless dialogues with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which has never had any power over domestic concern. President Barack Obama, they went on, led the West in playing down concerns with China on human rights and was conspicuous by his unwillingness to help Liu in his fellow Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He raised Liu Xiaobo's case publicly only once after he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and whatever he might have said privately clearly had no impact. At the same time, he did not join the 134 Nobel laureates to a letter to Xi Jinping and did not publicly condemn Liu Xiao's detention under house arrest, and even threatened to veto a bill passed by the Senate to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza. Finally, Chinese security officials even exploited the United States' repeated refusal to help Toulouse in torture sessions with detained Chinese dissidents. They explained to their victims that they surely must have observed that Washington had refused to help the world's only imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate and his wife. So what hope could they expect when they were to be disappeared, tortured, or imprisoned? The American refusal of support to Liu Xiaobo gave Xi Jinping license to act with total impunity to repress domestic dissent. In 1994, on one of many trips to the People's Republic of China, I met with Wei Jingsheng for dinner. He had just been let out of prison in an attempt by the Chinese government, one high-value political prisoner, to get Olympics 2000. They didn't. He got rearrested and was brutalized, finally came here on humanitarian parole, near death. He told me something I will never forget. When you are weak and vacillating and kowtowing to this dictatorship, they beat us more in the prison camps, in the Laogai. When you're tough, predictable, with professionalism, they beat us less. We have seen 8 years of retreat by the Obama administration. As the chairman knows, he and I have co-chaired hearings over these years, pleading with the Obama administration to take a tougher stance. I believe and hope the long overdue sea change in support for human rights in China may be changing. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has already denied funding to the UN Population Fund because of their horrific complicity in the Coercive Population Control Program, a program that began in 1979. There are now 62 million missing girls. That's the disparity. There's far more that have been killed simply because they're girls. And yesterday, Secretary Tillerson named China as a Tier 3 country, egregious violator of human trafficking. We had hearing after hearing asking the previous secretaries of state and the Obama administration to name China Tier 3 and sanction them, and they wouldn't do it. There was one automatic downgrade that was required by the law, but they wouldn't do it because of the facts. I think that we may be seeing a change of heart by the United States government, which bodes well for the human rights lawyers, the political prisoners, the religious prisoners, and that is our hope. Two things already. The President's administration, I said before, Nikki Haley has said, yes, we do want him to be allowed to leave along with his wife, Liu Xiaobo, and hopefully that will be the case. So I do have just one question, and if there's time permitting, I have many more to follow after the distinguished chairman. But Dr. Tong, you are one of the founders of the Human Rights Accountability Center, which is aiming at using the Magnitsky Act, Global Magnitsky Act, to bring sanctions against Chinese human rights violators. What has been your experience so far with the new administration? It's a new law, obviously, but is there an openness to singling out and holding individuals to account for torture and other gross violations of human rights?
Thank you very much. After the Global Magnitsky Act enacted, we founded the China Human Rights Accountability Center in this January, and we tried our best to collect the information, the evidence of the human rights abusers and corrupt officials, including the current Minister of Public Security. And we have provided materials to the State Department, and we have established a website, the first it's difficult to collect some informations, and sometimes it's hard to meet the requirement of the American government. And second, we understand that the President of the United States has a discretion power to use this Magnitsky Act more or less. So I do hope the American Congress, the CECC, can send a clear message to give pressure to the White House and the President. It is very, very important to implement the Global Magnitsky Act, especially regarding Chinese corrupt officials and perpetrators, because United States should not be a safe haven to Chinese perpetrators and corrupt officials. Thank you.
This is a general question for the whole panel. If you speak to people involved in setting policy in the new administration, their argument is they do want to raise human rights issues, but they believe they're best raised one-on-one in private meetings in an effort to allow the Chinese Communist Party officials to save face, in essence, to not be embarrassed publicly, that they respond better to a private one-on-one setting as opposed to public denunciations of the kind that we're conducting here today. The flip side of it is, I know that one of the arguments oppressors make, not just in China, but all over the world, to the oppressed is nobody cares about you. Everyone's forgotten about you. You might as well give up because you're just not important enough, and the United States is not going to break or harm their relations with us because of your case. What is your view on, number one, the idea that somehow human rights are best raised with the Chinese officials privately versus the sort of more open, more open highlighting of these cases for the world to see? And second, is what we do here, irrespective of the administration, is what we do here, whether it's on this commission, on the Senate floor, on the House floor, in our letters, in our resolutions, does it matter? Does it make a difference? I certainly know they read it in the Chinese government because I know they get upset about it. But what about to the activists and to those who, what impact does it have? Because it's important for our colleagues sometimes to understand the impact that what we do here is not simply symbolic, and if it is, I'd want to know that too, obviously. So two separate questions. Is there the view of the private versus public? And second, what about our role here in Congress, and when we have meetings on this commission or make statements or do resolutions, does that have an impact? Does that matter? And if you want to go first, Mr. Halliday.
I cannot say what kind of efficacy there is in private interventions, but it is a very common point made by the Chinese government and by others that such relationships should be private. However, in my empirical research and the work of our team, speaking to many activist lawyers over a period of time, there is absolutely no doubt in their mind that China must be spoken to publicly and China must be publicly shamed. And at this moment, from our long-standing research, I have no doubt that when the world speaks out loud and publicly, China listens. China has a very thin skin. When the American Bar Association awarded its International Human Rights Prize to Wang Yu, within 48 hours, the Global Times had an editorial trying to rebut that move. That tells me that not only was China listening, but China felt it had to respond. And finally, the point that you made, Mr. Chairman, is that in our interviews with notable activists, time and again, they have said that when there is public calling for their release or public calling for news about them, their treatment is improved. They can perceptibly point to the day or the week or the month when their treatment changes, when the international community has turned the spotlight publicly on their plight.
Yeah, I think both private and public pressure dialogues are useful, but I think this kind of pressure should not be only lip service. It should be giving real pressure to Chinese government, and should be follow up and you should send a clear message to Chinese government that this human rights issue or a list of political prisoners or one certain case, really matters, and it should have negative consequence if you don't respect your own constitution or the international human rights standard. And when I was detained and tortured, the United States is my important hope. So if United States refuses to pay attention to Chinese freedom and human rights, and the people in the prison, the people in custody, will be very, very hopeless. Yeah. Thank you.
I think the both private and public way is needed, because for the private part, I think for the individual cases like Chen Guangchen, we can the American government can talk to a Chinese government personally to save those individual and specific cases. And for the public, those are for the underprivileged people who is under threatened. So I think the private work should work for the lawyers and the human rights defenders who is already persecuted, and the public ways working for the underprivileged people to protect them in the future. And I think that the Congress is definitely working. It's not just our voice being heard, but for example, I went to the Chinese embassy with my petition and my signatures, but as a Chinese legal citizen, nobody would even see me. But I can talk through here, and the Congress has the power to talk with the White House, and the White House has the power to summon the Chinese ambassador to respond to my petition. So I definitely think the Congress is doing some work. Thank you very much.
I think it's just a matter of accountability. Whatever is privately said, nobody knows who is going to hold people accountable, both the Chinese officials and the U.S. officials. We don't know what was promised, what was raised, and how can you hold anybody accountable if nothing happens afterwards. And the other issue is the information imbalance. In China, there's already so much secrecy. Secret detention, secret interrogation, disappearances, and now they just revised the government public information disclosure law, make it practically no information would be disclosed. So we already don't know so many things, and we are, going to advocate further secrecy in human rights discussions. I think we're not on a playing field when we're talking about U.S. officials meeting with Chinese officials. So I think abusers of human rights are mostly afraid of the sunshine. They're afraid of information. They're afraid of people knowing what they did, and afraid of knowing being asked to change their behaviors.
In the past, when we have interacted with rights activists and others in China, a number of them have told us that they have experienced both some level of harassment, even when here in the United States, even on Capitol Hill, actually, by those working on behalf of the oppressors. But more importantly, the sort of implied threat that they could reach them anywhere in the world, that if they had to reach out and affect their lives in some way, they could do it, that they really weren't safe anywhere, that these sort of threats. I just wanted to ask, because all of you have been so vocal and open on some of these issues, have any of you, if you're comfortable sharing, obviously, ever felt, as if you have been the subject of that sort of implied or direct threat of intimidation, either here while present in the continental United States, even perhaps because of your appearance here today? And if you're not comfortable saying, then obviously that's an answer too.
I would like to share some of my experience. After my father was arrested, he was completely missing. We didn't receive any warrant, and so we do not know where they took them or who took them. That's one of the pressure we got, and the police also summoned my mom to ask her to divorce with my father, and I was on the threatened list to my mom. That's the reason why my family sent me here to keep me safe. But I think at the first 2 years, I was threatened by the government, and I kept silence. And
I apologize. To be clear, your first 2 years while you were still in China,
Oh,
or
no,
while you were
I'm
here?
Here, yeah,
And
my
what-
first 2 years here.
How were you threatened?
I just because for example the lawyer Wang Yu, his family members just took it away by the secret agents in the airport, and also the police officers went to my family friends and other family members to threaten them, and me and my mom kind of get isolated. So I'm just worrying about everything, and I was scared. I just kept silence here, but I've learned what is right to do and what is justice, I would say. So the pressure turned to my power, and I would have a chance to speak here.
So to be clear, while you were here already for how long have you been here now?
2 years.
In the 2 years that you've been here, there were times where you chose, at least initially, to be careful what you said or spoke out for fear of retribution against friends and or loved ones in China?
Uh-huh. Yeah, so basically it went to my mom, and I was scared. Yeah. Cuz when the police officer broke in my house, I was there. I saw everything, and honestly, my family didn't share with me with all the politically stuff when I was a child. So I was scared badly.
I have a lot of stories that my friends, including Chen Guangcheng and some activists in the United States, were intimidated by Chinese government when they are here. Even including some activists were attacked physically when they were in a protest. I myself, when I was in
Attacked physically here in the United States?
in California, by some unidentified person, and obviously they are hired by Chinese government or Chinese embassy. And when I was in Boston Harvard Law School, my wife and one of my daughters were banned from going to the United States. So we were separated for nearly 1 year. Obviously, the purpose of their travel ban is to silence me. And my last winter, my wife was fired by the company she was working for because of the clear pressure from the Chinese government. So they use all kinds of the collective punishment to marginalize, to silence, to intimidate the human rights activists in the United States.
Okay. I know the co-chairman has further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can I just ask you, Dr. Tong, or Mr. Tong, you might want to speak to this, how the crackdown on lawyers, and maybe Mr. Halliday, you as well, the crackdown on lawyers, how has it impacted on civil society? It seems when you go after the lawyers, the impact has to be even more profound. We know the NGO law, the religious freedom crackdown that's gotten even worse under Xi Jinping, tightening the screws, making it harder and harder and harder. And then when your last resort, and Doc, you might want to speak, Dr. Lee, to this as well, Does this just chill civil society?
Yeah, in China there are altogether 300,000 lawyers, but only several hundred human rights lawyers. During this 709 crackdown, almost all active and famous human rights lawyers were either arrested or disappeared or interrogated. So for the whole civil society, it is harder than before to find a human rights lawyer to represent their cases. So the vulnerable groups, the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and other religious groups, the petitioners. So they were also targeted. Many of these, other activists and house churches were arrested and sentenced, lawyers have more risk than before to take these sensitive cases. So the chilling effect of the roundup of human rights lawyers is very very strong, and many lawyers have to give up and have to keep silence. But on the other hand, some new lawyers can still stand up to join the human rights movement, and some new activists are courageous enough to stand up, to speak out. So what the government want to achieve is a total silence. But I don't think the Communist Party can destroy the whole civil society, the whole movement completely. Thank you.
Let me just, yes, Dr. Halliday.
May I add that civil society is a vast number of people in China. And following Dr. Tang Biao, the thought that it is possible indefinitely to repress hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who want to be able to express their views or who want to get legal representation is very hard to imagine. If you imagine the Christians alone, 80 to 100 million Christians, China's largest civil society group, can you entirely cut them off from any kind of connection or leadership with these rights lawyers? And in fact, our research deals with grassroots lawyers more broadly. But it does seem clear to me that the intent of the party is to take lawyers who were previously able to represent people in the kinds of grievances that Dr. Tang Biao has just mentioned, and suddenly change the minds of the Chinese people about the role that these lawyers play. As one eminent China specialist said, in the past, lawyers were seen as representatives of people who are vulnerable and with grievances. Now what the state is saying with charges of subversion against lawyers is that lawyers are enemies of the state. Lawyers are enemies of the party. Lawyers are enemies of China. So there seems a very deliberate effort simultaneously to crush the civil society, which I cannot believe can continue indefinitely, and at the same time to disconnect civil society from the kind of leadership that it can have among activist lawyers.
Yes, Dr. Lee.
But in fact, the crackdown on lawyers is a shorthand because a lot of them are not lawyers. For example, Tang Biao mentioned Wu Gan, and who is still in detention facing trial, and several of them have already been sentenced, like Hu Sigan and Yi Xuan. These people are also been detained in the crackdown on lawyers. And the second point I think you brought up is the overseas NGOs law. We have a lot of international NGOs protesting, but in fact, the law most directly impacts domestic Chinese NGOs because several leaders of those NGOs have been detained, they've been interrogated and incriminated for taking foreign funding or working with foreign organizations We should particularly mention Huang Qi, Liu Feiyue, and those are local human rights NGO directors. And the third point I want to say is China has systematically been revising or putting out new laws, like the National Security Law, the Internet Security Law, the Anti-Terror Act, and one by one, further restricting space for civil society and using state security to persecute people, and not only physical space for organizing, for freedom of association, but the online space for speech and information. So what we're looking at is not only the unusual quietness of the civil society, but also the infrastructure change to further repress any development of civil society.
I just have one more question and one comment, if I could. If there are any lobbyists or lawyers representing the Chinese embassy here today, you don't have to stand up, but it would be nice if you would. But I would ask you, and I mean this with respect, would you be willing to take the petitions with some 90,000 signatures back to the Chinese embassy? Come and see me or one of the witnesses or Chairman Rubio before the hearing is over, but it would be nice if you would consider doing that. I, too, have gone to the Chinese embassy to deliver petitions, and we stood outside, never even got in through the door. It was appalling, lack of diplomatic civility. Let me, my final question would be, Dr. Lee or anyone who would like to speak to it, back in the 1980s, I traveled, I've been here since 1981, with Armando Valladares, who Ronald Reagan so wisely picked to be our head of delegation, made an ambassador. He had spent, as Marco Rubio knows, who has been absolutely tenacious in fighting against human rights abuse all over the world, but including Cuba. Armando Valladares wrote a book, Against All Hope, which revealed the absolute and horrific use of torture and all kinds of repression by the Castro brothers and the entire regime. But my takeaway from that trip, besides pushing for human rights in Cuba, was the hypocrisy of the Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission. That was replaced by the Human Rights Council, which was with promises and bells and whistles about how it would be different. And yet rogue players, including Cuba today, China today, sit on that panel and spend most of their time criticizing Israel, while China, even during its periodic review, gets through without almost unscathed. On one of those more recent trips to Geneva for a Human Rights Council meeting, I went to the press conference being hosted by the Chinese and asked one question after another of their ambassador, who finally just shut down and left and walked out the door because they didn't want to answer any real questions. They wanted softballs by a compliant press, kissy-faced diplomacy by people who say, oh, aren't you just great and making progress, while people are being tortured and treated with impunity. My question would be, and Dr. Lee, you might want to speak to it, as backers of the Convention Against Torture, Manfred Nowak, I may be wrong on this, was the last one to actually get into China as the special rapporteur. That was, what, 2005? And yet we get all this talk and this talk of transparency and openness, and yet special rapporteurs cannot get in to look at the torture situation. And I would just say parenthetically, when I was pushing against what Google was doing in censoring the internet and doing just what the Chinese government wanted it to do, when you went and put in torture, and I did it myself in a cafe later on, years later in the internet cafe in Beijing, you write in torture and you get Gitmo, and you get what the Japanese did, which was horrific, to the Chinese during the Second World War. Nothing about Manfred Nowak's work or any of the other commentaries on the pervasive use of torture by the Chinese. How do we get the UN Human Rights Council? I have brought it up personally with Prince Zaid, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and say, you know, the respectability of your group and the council itself, as well as your bureaucracy, are compromised when you look the other way, and that is what is happening to these horrific offenses now against human rights abusers, human rights defenders, by human rights abusers, but the prevalent use of torture. How do we reform the Human Rights Council and get the UN to finally step up and say, as was said earlier in testimony, they are thin-skinned. When that ambassador walked off the stage, it was like, let's engage, however long it takes. Show me where I'm wrong. And, and I, of course, have had a lot of documentation in my hand that I handed to one of his deputies as he walked out the door.
When China was being voted for the last Human Rights Council membership, among 193 countries, 185 voted for China. The number could be 184, 86, but it's about that many. So do the math. Where are the pro-democracy, pro-human rights governments? What are they voting? Whom are they voting? So it is very difficult to fight at the UN for human rights abusers, just as in here, in this country, everywhere. So, but that's not a reason for us to back down. And the way I'm saying this is, first, when the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights sent out a statement about lawyers, about Liu Xiaobo, about Tibet, China protests immediately. That means it matters. Matters when voice is coming out of that forum. During any kind of treaty review of China's obligations to not only the Convention Against Torture, but social economic rights, rights of the child, they would send a huge delegation to do what? To work on the members of the treaty committees one-on-one, to issue threats, to basically just try to get them to talk differently. And this didn't work in most cases. I think the members are pretty independent. So what it means is that the Chinese government does care about face, and they do not want to lose face in those forums. That means it's important for us to present solid evidence to, at the same time, while the government is trying to influence those reviewing process, including the Universal Periodic Review, civil society should also use that forum. Other governments should also use that forum to fight them nail and tooth, to really be using that forum rather than saying, okay, we give up when this forum is discredited, we are out of here. Then you know what's gonna happen. China is increasing its donation to the UN, and they are becoming ever more active in the Human Rights Council and all the UN, human rights forums. And they're going to buy, they're going to lobby, they're going to get votes from other countries, and they're going to not only get away from their human rights violations, but change that institution. They wanted to rewrite the treaties. They wanted to do all that to get away from, basically. So I think all this means it's a very important battleground. We should not give up on it.
Mr. Co-Chairman, may I also say that as a U.S. citizen and as an observer of international influence, I feel it's imperative that the U.S. government should maintain its leadership position in the United Nations Rights Council. I know you raised the question of reform, and I know that there are issues there. Nevertheless, it is critical that China does not erode or dilute universal norms of law or lawyers or rights. And the Human Rights Council, despite its defects, is nevertheless a prominent forum. It's a prominent forum not only for states that will be outspoken and bold in support of the international moral and political order, but it's a crucial forum for non-state organizations to be able to bring their observations into this United Nations forum. It asserts global norms. It maintains some kind of level of accountability. I would say, frankly, that for the U.S. to surrender to an authoritarian country like China would be defeatist. And indeed, ultimately, it will be counterproductive both for the foreign policy of the United States, but also for the international moral and legal order. Thank you.
I just have one follow-up question on that, and that is, for example, about 2 weeks ago, we saw the nation of Panama break its relations with Taiwan for purposes of appeasing a position that China had exerted influence. I've had cities in my home state come to me and ask for us to open the way for Chinese consulates, but of course the price of opening a Chinese consulate in a city is the closure of a Taiwanese one. So we know that these efforts that you've described in terms of pressure diplomatically, they also exert on nations outside that context and even here domestically. And I was just curious whether anyone here had an experience here in the United States where you were either not allowed to speak or disinvited at a university and to a business, at a media outlet, anywhere, where you felt that perhaps your voice, that your potential hosts were dissuaded from giving you an opportunity to participate because of pressure from China here in the United States.
So I have two examples that my scheduled speech were canceled by universities in the United States.
Which ones? Which universities?
Yeah, one is Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah. So
Why did they tell you they canceled the speech?
I think 2 years ago, when the president of Harvard was visiting China, and Chen Guangcheng and I were going to give a speech at Harvard, and they canceled it. So, I think last time when I was here, I was giving a testimony about my own book that was canceled by AB, American Bar Association. So they invited me to write a book, and I signed the agreement. But they later rescinded the proposal, saying that publishing my book will endanger their programs in China. So
the American Bar Association, which represents lawyers and therefore defenders of justice, canceled the publication of a book that they invited you to write because they were afraid it endangered their programs in China.
yes.
But we did write a letter on that regard. But I want people to hear that so that they understand that this is not something happening halfway around the world. They're doing it to people and organizations in the United States with, I imagine, the threat of being unable to participate in activities in China. There are either economic or other repercussions. Is there any other? Do you have another one, or those are the two that come to mind? You said there were two universities. Do you remember what the second one was?
No, just
Just
I can't. So there are some other examples that they try to invite me, but because I'm sensitive, I'm going to talk about human rights, politics, and they refuse to invite me. And a lot of experience that when I was giving a talk in the university, the other department, like Chinese department or Confucius Institute, they refused to forward the posters, and they told their students not to come to my presentation.
Did someone else have someone to add? Anyone else have a similar experience that they could share? Well, do you have any further questions?
No, just thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank you all for being here. I know at varying degrees, but across the board, it takes some level of real courage. We've heard not just about the threats of cancellation, but the real risk to family. And we're blessed to live in this republic where oftentimes the worst things that happens is somebody says something really mean about us on Twitter. And these hearings are a good reminder that in many parts of the world, including the most populous nation on earth, the consequences of speaking out or dissent are significantly higher. And I think it speaks to the essence of who we want to be as a nation and as a people. Is America simply a geographic territory, or is it also an idea? And if we're an idea, then And that idea is that we believe all human beings are entitled to rights that are given to them at birth by their creator, and government's job is to protect them, not to deny those rights, not to decide them, and certainly not to deny them. And we seek not to impose our point of view on the world. It's not, some people would disagree with that statement, but I'm not, and nor do we seek to contain China. China is an ancient, revered culture with thousands of years of contribution to mankind. Some of the greatest inventions and innovations in human history came from China. It is a nation with an incredible history, and I believe an incredible future. I welcome China's rise in many ways. I don't welcome a totalitarian state's rise. I do welcome China's rise because I believe its people have the opportunity to contribute. And we seek partnership with the people of China to solve, just think about the problems in the world today. If somehow there was a Chinese government that cared about the rights of all mankind combined with the work, could work together with us, I think we'd be a lot further along in some of the major issues confronting this country. But when you don't care about the rights of your own people, why would you care about the rights of anybody else? And that's our problem with the Chinese Communist Party and its leadership, not its people. And I'll remain hopeful that that will change. But in the interim, we'll continue hopefully to speak on behalf of those who agree with us, but don't have the opportunity to express it openly in the nation of their birth. So we are just grateful to all of you for being here, for your time, for your testimony, for your contribution. We look forward to sharing your testimony with our colleagues and continuing to address these issues time and again. And with that, thank you for starting the meeting today. Again, to our co-chairman. With that, our hearing is adjourned.